At the start of the 20th century, the idea of using the so-called hail of fire technique alongside your big guns was beginning to fall out of favour. In America, ships designed with this in mind had some unique features, the strangest being installing pairs of 8-inch guns directly on top of the 12-inch turrets. This was a poor design choice with many problems, but it was not entirely the shipyard's fault. The US Congress at the time was working in a fairly self-contradictory manner, so no real change there, and wanted to build a modern fleet, but also to do so cheaply. To try and force this to happen, the politicians decided to limit the money available and dictate the size of the ships being built. Because, of course, politicians know how to build warships. This was the primary cause of a lot of design choices that compromised the US Navy's fighting capacity at the time. In the case of these ships, it meant that although the US Navy had the ideas and designs for a ship with a unified main battery before the British, they were not able to build the South Carolina and its sister, the Michigan, before the British built the HMS Dreadnought. Additionally, unlike almost all other dreadnoughts, which were larger than their predecessors, Congress limited the tonnage of these ships to the same as the Connecticut-class pre-dreadnoughts, which had preceded them. As a result, the ships were slow, barely scraping past 18 knots, and they retained the old triple expansion engine design instead of the more modern turbines. This meant that although theoretically they were only about 3 knots slower than their British counterparts, the American ships were in practice about 5 knots slower over long distances, which in turn would slow down any fleet they sailed with and leave them at a tactical disadvantage. They also carried masts that were made of a lattice-like cage structure that was supposed to allow shells through with minimal damage, to keep the fire control system intact as long as possible. In practice, however, the cage masts were weak and kept flexing back and forth, making them less suitable than the more solid masts used in other navies. At one point, a mast on the Michigan collapsed in a storm, killing several of the crew. Finally, to save weight, the forward part of the ship was a deck lower than the original design, which meant that the ship was vulnerable to water coming over and causing problems for the forward guns in high seas or at high speed. It wasn't all bad, though. The ships had one of the thickest armour belts to be found on a first-generation dreadnought, and, more importantly, had super-firing turrets. This is where a second turret is placed immediately behind and above the first, allowing it to fire over the first turret in the same direction. This allowed the turrets to be placed closer together, and so the 4 turrets, each with twin 12-inch guns, could fire on both the port and starboard sides. This gave the ship the same broadside of 8 guns as other first-generation dreadnoughts, but only needing 8 guns to do so. The British needed 10 guns, and the Germans and Japanese needed 12 to have the same number of guns available on the broadside. It was because of this need for fewer guns that the ship could afford to retain the heavy armour it needed. The majority of the design compromises mentioned earlier were a result of having to fit everything into a relatively small 16,000-ton hull. The super-firing turret arrangement was superior to the wing turrets on other dreadnoughts, and most following battleships adopted this feature. Like the HMS Dreadnought, a secondary battery of 3-inch guns was installed to deal with torpedo boats, along with a pair of torpedo tubes to deal with something. At first, the ships were used to visit foreign ports to show other major nations that America had arrived on the world stage as a naval power, and then, once newer battleships were ready, the South Carolina and Michigan were used to patrol the Caribbean area to look after American interests in the region. Unfortunately, with the outbreak of World War I, the penny pinching by Congress was to be their downfall. Between poor seakeeping and low speed, they were judged to be an impediment to any force sent over the Atlantic, since the British Grand Fleet had a general maximum fleet speed of 21 knots, which these ships just could not hope to reach. So they spent the war patrolling the US East Coast alongside older pre-dreadnoughts, followed by a period bringing back US personnel once the war was over. Like HMS Dreadnought, they were listed as surplus to requirements at the Washington Naval Conference, and within days of the treaty presented there being signed, they were decommissioned and sold to be scrapped. Whilst the Dreadnought would give its name to subsequent battleships, the legacy of the South Carolina was in the gun layout, with many famous warships like Warspite, Hood, Bismarck, Nagato, and Washington using a similar layout of 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft, and almost every other battleship class using superfiring turrets, even when they use triple or quadruple mounts.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.